Hi, I'm Clara Rotter-Lateman. Welcome to the Veterans History Project. Today I'm interviewing my grandfather, Seymour Rotter, a World War II veteran. So, my first question is, were you drafted into the war?
No, I was not. I enlisted in May of 1942 after the Navy came to Cornell, where I was a freshman at that time, and started offering a program which I was interested in. And it took them from something around February until May to complete the process, and then I was in the reserve.
Mm-hmm. What motivated you to join?
It's a good question. I came from a family where politics was a regular subject of discussion. And the 30s, during the years that I was growing up and going through high school, were very turbulent years in the rest of the world. And with the rise of Mussolini and Hitler in Europe, I know I did, and I'm sure many other people did too, have a sense of foreboding as to how this was going to end up, so that when Pearl Harbor took place, it was a surprise on one level, but it was a kind of anticipation on another. The shoe finally dropped, and so I was, in a sense, ready for that.
Mm-hmm. So you felt that you were prepared and you knew
Right,
you would...
and I felt I wanted to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm. So you were 18?
I was 8 when the war broke out just before I turned 18, and I was 18 when I was enlisted.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any fears or excitements about your position in the Navy?
Well, those are two very important words, because the reality is, and I read this all the time, and I'm sure you've heard it too, anyone who says they're not frightened, is either an idiot or a liar. But beyond that, there is a kind of excitement that goes with it, and to be young and not to be responsible for other people in the sense that you have, wife and children and what have you, to worry about. The excitement is an offsetting factor, and I think that probably describes what went into it, a mixture of both.
Right. How did you communicate with the people back at home, your parents and
Not
siblings?
terribly often. For one thing, we weren't accustomed to spending hours on the phone. Even before the war, a call was 2 minutes, I think, or 3 minutes, and that was it. And when I was in the States, I probably spoke to my folks perhaps once a week or 2 or 3 times a month, and for 3 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Right.
After that, just letters.
Right.
And so I went 15 months without talking to them at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite different from what it is today.
What was really the hardest thing that you had to leave behind at home and going?
Well, I suppose leaving the family for one, but again, I think the sense of adventure was an overwhelming
So that
and
motivated
exhilarating kind of thing. So never having been west of New Jersey, to suddenly find myself in California
you.
was an interesting change in life.
How long were you in the Navy?
I was on active duty for 38 months.
Mm-hmm. And where did you travel? I mean, I know I've heard a lot of your stories.
Well,
Where did you go?
initially, I trained before I was commissioned in the East, and at that point I was transferred to California to start my training in what was called the amphibious branch of the Navy, where we trained in landing craft, starting with Coronado, which is right near San Diego in Southern California, and then moving up further north to a place somewhere about halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco called Morro Bay, where we had another amphibious training base. And we were there for several months, practicing landings with Army units in the area, and then finally up to the San Francisco area, where we trained for embarkation, infantry type training, because we were going to be on the land as well as on the water. And then from there we shipped out to Hawaii, and then from there across the Pacific to the Carolines and the Gilbert Islands and the Marianas, and then eventually to the Philippines, where we spent a fair amount of time before we left for Okinawa.
Mm-hmm. What was daily life like, from day to day, not
Oh.
the big adventures, but just every day?
I think the word that comes into play that I've heard from many people who've been involved in that type of thing was boredom, because military life is scheduled 24/7. So you're never really your own master for more than a minute. And a lot of the time you spend is that it's hurry up and wait. So that a lot of it is just spent waiting for the shoe to drop, so to speak, and for something to happen. When it finally happens, it's almost a sense of relief that you know, well, here it is, we're going, we're doing, what have you. But up until that time, there are days when you can go out of your gourd, you know, because of the monotony of the routine. But it's not terrible, it's just boring.
Right. So how did you guys entertain yourselves?
Well, that varied. I mean, reading was always an outlet for some. Playing cards was an outlet for others. Going for hours on end was another thing that you could do. And I think in part the experience of being on the ocean for literally months on end and watching the sea change and what have you, that in itself was interesting and pleasant.
So when you weren't on the boat, what did you guys do?
Well, when we were stationed ashore, you had all the normal activities that go with living on the beach. Aboard ship, it's like a floating city in the sense that everything is housed on the ship. On land, you have the mess hall and the tent, if you were living in a tent at that point, and the routine of getting the place operational. In landing craft, we generally had probably 100 boats anchored right off the shore where we were staying, and it took a lot of nursing, so to speak, to keep them operational and get the people located where they had to be in order to get them out and running. Because we were essentially the arteries between ship and shore and ship and ship. And that's what kept men and supplies moving at all times. So that was a good part of the life ashore.
Have you gone back to any of those places since? And
Well,
how was that an experience for you?
interestingly enough, in 1987, your grandmother and I made a trip to Asia. And I had a chance to go back to my last stop after I left Okinawa, which was Shanghai. And we spent, I guess, about 2 weeks in China. And one of the last stops we made before we went back to Hong Kong was in the city of Shanghai, which I visited in March of 1946. And it was a fascinating place. I never thought when I was a youngster that I'd ever end up seeing that city in real life. It was something out of a movie, in a sense. But to go back there, and it hadn't changed all that much between 1946 and 1987. I understand if you go back now, even since the time that we were there, it's a totally changed experience. I mean, the buildings are the same buildings you'd see in Chicago or New York or elsewhere. It's a bustling, thriving place. Then it was still, I would say, borderline primitive. People were transporting fresh meat tied to the back of a bicycle. And if you thought of that in terms of the sanitary requirements of delivering food in this country, the thought that somebody was riding through all the muck and gook with a chicken on the back of his bicycle or whatever, it was a little unnerving, but that's what was going on. Or in passing bricks to build a building, they were passed from hand to hand. That was the assembly line,
Right.
and that kind of thing. But it was a fascinating place.
What did you miss the most? I mean, I'm sure quickly you learned that Navy life was not the same as what you were used to at home. So what was the thing you missed the most, or look forward to coming back to?
Well, I would say getting back to what would have been my normal routine. I left college at a point where I was really getting into it.
Right.
And this was really an interruption of what would have been the normal flow of my life experience. However, we were kept busy, and a lot of what went on during that period of time was a combination of what you had to do and the things you cooked up to amuse yourself by tormenting other people. So it was a combination of the two. The kind of stuff that people do at camp and what have you.
Right.
It's
sure
not
a lot
that.
of comedy was.
They say that there's not much difference between men and boys except the price of their toys. And life goes on. If you're living in a tent with half a dozen other guys, it's the same thing you would have experienced if you went to camp and somebody hit somebody's shoes, for argument's sake.
Right.
Or whatever.
Were a lot of other people at that time, like, friends and people you knew from college, were they all, choosing to go into service?
Yeah, I'd say almost everyone I knew did. Offhand, I can't even think of anyone who didn't,
Right.
but I'm sure there must have been some.
Did they all go to the Navy, or did they?
No, I think we were scattered all over the place. I mean, before I went into the Navy, I spent some time in the ROTC, which was required at Cornell. And some people stayed I was in the field artillery. Most of them who stayed with that ended up in the field artillery. And others were scattered depending on if they were medically inclined, they might have ended up in some aspect of Navy service doing that.
Mm-hmm. Have you remained friends with any of the people you knew from the Navy?
With a few, not too many, because we were ultimately, we came from every state in the Union, and
Right.
ultimately we were scattered to the four winds.
Mm-hmm.
But I've had an occasion to get a call from someone I hadn't seen in 25 or 30 years, who was living in California, who
Right.
showed up and had lunch with him and his wife on that occasion. And a couple of people I still talk to on a regular basis. Although we live miles apart, we still maintain some contact.
Is there anything, that you learned from your experience in the Navy? What was the most significant, like, for yourself?
Well, I don't want to be how shall I put it, kind of person who thinks there's good under every rock. But I would say that I felt living with all kinds of people in all kinds of circumstances was probably the most important part of my experience. That people who had never seen people from that group during their growing up years suddenly found that you were a human being and they were human beings, and we all had, we all bled if we were cut, and we all cried if somebody stepped on our toes and what have you. And the ability to live together with a reasonable degree of harmony and work together did happen. And that wasn't necessarily true either before the war or even for years after the war here. But hopefully it's coming. But I think that was one of the most important things.
Did being Jewish affect your...
Well, I was thinking along those lines when I answered your last question, because I did meet people who had never met anyone who was Jewish before then. And, although it didn't happen to me, people would say on occasion, they'd approach and someone would say, where are the horns on your head, kind of thing. And there were people who literally believed that this is what they'd heard back where they came from, and there must be people who do have horns on their head. I found out later on where that concept came from. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in the Bible they talk about the rays of light emanating from the head of Moses were like horns of light. Right. So they had picked up on that, and suddenly everyone had to have horns if they were Jewish.
Wow, that's interesting. It seems like there was a lot of spare time, but was there any, really... did you ever feel like a sense of danger in?
Oh yes, it unfortunately didn't last for 38 months. But I mean, the critical period for us were the 3 months after the invasion at Okinawa. And for my type of unit, what was exceptional was the landing itself wasn't the rough patch, it was the kamikaze period that started with the landing and continued until the end of June of that year, and that made life a little more exciting than we necessarily planned.
Touch on that